Hey, welcome back, everybody. I hope you're ready to jump into unlearning in the contextual intelligence framework. So we're going to talk about that first movement in the framework where we unlearn cleansing, perception, and sensing. Again, we're anchoring this in Philippians 2 that the Bible doesn't just tell us what to think about. If anything is lovely, beautiful, true, think on these things. But the Bible tells us how to think, right? The mind of Christ. Have the same mind in you that was in Jesus. And then Paul in Philippians 2 describes that mind. If you have any consolation, any love, any compassion, have the same mind in you that was in Jesus. And then he describes that mind in Philippians 2. So we're using that as a way to think about how we relate to our communities, how we actively engage in ministry, the mind of Christ, having that same mind in us. And thinking of that as a kind of a series of movements, if you will, the very movements of Jesus' own life, and how do we apply that in our local community and local context. So we'll jump right in with the first movement, which is unlearning. And this refers to cleansing the gates of perception to consciously choose to give up, abandon, or stop using knowledge, values, or behaviors to acquire new ones. So there's been a lot of psychological and sociological research on the concept of unlearning that I'm excited to share a little bit about that. But to start biblically speaking, this is the kenosis. This is the emptying self. One way to explore the significance of that is to explore how Jesus yielded to normal human development as a human being while remaining fully God, that great mystery of the incarnation, right? He grew up in a little town called Nazareth. He was called a Nazarene. And Luke reminds us, quoting back from Samuel, actually, that Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and humanity. And I like to think of that as kind of an intentional unlearning on Jesus' part. When he emptied himself, there's a lot of speculation about what that is, the glory of God, his divine rights, attributes as the Son of God. What the scripture is pretty clear about is that he goes through the normal human developmental process and experiences everything a human being experiences in the way that a human being experiences. He's fully human and he's fully God. So Jesus, being the one who created all things, right, unlearns, becomes a baby, becomes a little boy growing up in Nazareth, the son of a carpenter. So there's a whole unlearning that happens there. Now, we can only go so far with this idea, right? It's not a thing we can solve. It's an irresolvable paradox, the humanness and the godness of Jesus in one person, right? But there's definitely a demonstration here of an emptying in a normal developmental process, and the humility to empty, to unlearn, to embrace vulnerability is a fundamental characteristic of the mind of Christ. It's at the top of to understand the mind of Christ, the first thing to know is kenosis, kanuo, emptying, unlearning, moving into fully in our human experience. So for the church, contextual intelligence requires some humility. It requires an emptying process, and that includes some of our foundational assumptions as primarily attractional, propositional, colonial iterations of the church. I hear this a lot in churches I've served where we've been in the same community for a long time. 1881, we were planted 18, and we think we know the community because we've been there for so long. We know what the community needs. Although it's interesting to note, a lot of people don't who attend the churches I've served don't live in the community anymore. They commute from other places, but we assume we still know our community in a deep way. And remember what I said in the opening module about context being like clouds formations, not clocks, that we actually maybe don't know everything there is to know about our community or what our community needs or the assets that our community has. So unlearning is the first step, cleansing what we think we know, having the humility to say, maybe we don't know the whole story. We don't know the whole picture. And one way to kind of, frame this is through mental models. Peter Singey, we're going to engage some of his work, but there's these ways that we think about things, right? A model for our thinking. Um, and that can be a mismatch sometimes with the reality that we find ourselves. So mental models can clash. My way that I framed reality, the way that I think things are, might be actually different than the way things really are. And sometimes we just have asked the wrong questions and think we have all the answers when we don't. So the first move, unlearning, is kind of cleansing the gates of perception, consciously choosing to give up, abandon, or stop using knowledge, values, or behavior to acquire new ones. And in an organizational sense, it's a process of clearing out the old routines and beliefs that no longer meet the current challenges. So when you frame it like that in sociological terms, do you see the need for some unlearning in us and in our local churches, right? I love this quote by Alvin Toffler: the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn, right? There's a process of learn, unlearn, relearn. So the major biblical word that describes a disciple of Jesus, mathetos, which translates follower or disciple or learner or student. So, in some way, every Jesus person, every follower of Jesus is a learner. We're disciples. Literally, it's built into the description of who we are as Jesus people, right? Jesus says, "Learn from me. You're my followers. I'm your teacher. You're learners of me," right? Learning how to do life like me, or letting me live my life through you, learning my way and my truth in my life. So discipleship really is this lifelong learning process. It's faith seeking understanding, which requires the church not to just be a community of practice, but a community of learning. And if we can embrace the fact that we are lifelong learners, no, I don't know anybody. Well, maybe I do know some people who think that they know everything there is to know about Jesus and the church and reality, but I don't think any human ever has achieved that. But maybe if we can agree that there is a lifelong journey of learning, that maybe that's going to include at times some unlearning. I know Jesus was doing that with his disciples. He was certainly doing that with the religious leaders of his day, trying to unlearn them some things they had assumed. So the church is a community of both learning and unlearning. Remember, we talked about these things, kind learning environments and wicked learning environments. Obviously, when you're in a wicked learning environment, you're constantly unlearning because you don't understand the reality around you. So you have to learn, what are the patterns? What is the status quo? How do I adapt, right? So it's constantly learning, unlearning, to survive in the environment. And if you think about this, so does experience always lead to expertise, right? If we've had an experience, does that mean we master it? Or if we've had an experience many times, does that mean that we just become prolific in it, right? And it doesn't. It really depends on the domain, the context in question. So inference involves reaching a conclusion on the basis of evidence. But yet inference must take place in an actual environment. So at the simplest level, the process involves two settings. Information is acquired, learning, reading the signs, taking it in, understanding, right? Information is applied, predictions or choices, knowing what to do. Remember, those are the two big parts of the contextual intelligence framework. And the environment shapes our outcomes. So kind learning environments, when there's a close match between informational elements, that's necessary for accurate inferences, while wicked learning environments often involve mismatches, right? So we just kind of experiment, iterate, try stuff, and learn, and we don't know fully. We just have to kind of experiment. So this allows us to identify sources of inferential errors. It also means to target corrective procedures and maximize behaviors. So, in other words, take it back to scripture. It influences how First Chronicles 12 32, the process of understanding the times and knowing what to do will unfold. The context, the environment is going to shape that. So think about how there can be a mismatch. Let's give three scenarios here, or three vignettes, I think, that actually we opened the book with. But this is a person taking action based on false inferences can create a wicked learn environment. So, for example, a clergy person who has a track record of serving declining congregations uses the same old method at a new church, once again, decline results. Self-fulfilling prophecy, right? That person is creating the scenario with their own behavior and actions by doing things that haven't worked in other places, just assuming that it's not going to work anywhere I go. Self-fulfilling prophecy. Another person maybe has a history of serving growing congregations, employs their same tried and true methods, and the congregation declines. Like they did a lot of preaching well and led Bible studies and teaching ministries, and the other churches they served grew. But this one doesn't, because their actions are guided by a range of data from past experiences but fail to understand the variations in the environment. So maybe the congregation they're currently serving is not a preaching, teaching based that thing, that they're a fellowship oriented congregation, or they're a caregiving or outreach oriented. And so they're trying to do the things that have always been successful elsewhere without understanding the people, the context, and adapting to the environment. So here's another scenario: a group of church leaders in a declining congregation receive a new pastor. They are convinced the decline is because of the last three pastors' ineffectiveness. Anybody been to this church, served this church? They enculturate the new pastor into their program, but the decline continues. Again, they're triggering this mismatch by basing their predictions on faulty assumptions. They're creating a wicked environment by assuming that it's the pastor's fault, and that if the pastor would just do what they were supposed to do, right? Not understanding that they're part of the problem and they're part of the solution. So some people debate, is unlearning even a possibility, right? Can you really unlearn something after you've learned it? These are the questions that keep sociologists up at night, right? But so once you have learned something, can you really not know it anymore? And there's a lot of studies on this, that yeah, you forget things over time and all of that. But unlearning is a different idea. It's a conscious choice to accept that what you learned was incorrect and then change that. So for example, there's a lot of studies in experimental psychology around recovery and substance abuse disorder. So if addicts, alcoholics, people that struggle with substance abuse disorder, their life depends on unlearning, because their life has been formed on these assumptions and these behaviors, these patterns, right, that now need to be unlearned and unraveled. So when you think about interventions for drug use to kind of get people away from those maladaptive behaviors, if unlearning does not occur, the intervention may yield temporary success, but relapse is common, right? Many interventions fail because they're ineffective at erasing or at least substantially modifying the underlying addictive behavior. That is, they don't cause true unlearning. So this study that I'm referencing here by Crossley, Maddox, and Ashby showed that when addicts return to the original context of drug use, they often relapse. Why is that? Because context always wins. In the safety of a rehab, right, where you don't have the triggers, you don't have the relationships, you don't have the things that trigger the use, you can get clean and sober and stay that way for a bit. When you return to the context of use, all those triggers, all those things unlock those old mental patterns and behaviors and actions, and then you fall right back into that, right? So context is a powerful thing. This is why contextual intelligence is so important. Interventions occur in the sanitized context of a safe place, a clinic, but the addiction driving stimulus response associations are removed in that environment. So when you go back into that, you immediately it triggers those things again. So you can unlearn in the clinic specific associations, but when you go back into the complexities of the original context of abuse, oftentimes it'll trigger that. Alcoholics Anonymous has a lot of wisdom around many things, but unlearning being one of those things. And one of the key people that wrote the doctor's opinion in the front of the big book, Dr. William Silkworth, noticed the problem of alcohol centers in the mind of an alcoholic, and it triggers an allergy that unleashes a phenomenon of craving. So, for those of us in recovery, when our brain gets triggered, this neurochemical thing happens to us that's not, doesn't happen in other people, right? A normal person who can drink a drink and put it down halfway through and call it a day, right? Alcoholic doesn't happen. It triggers this obsession, this craving thing. Um, but he encounters this kind of anomaly case who recovered this what we would call in sociology a positive deviant who is now helping other alcoholics recover. So he noticed that unless the person can experience what he called an entire psychic change, there's very little hope of recovery. And what that is, friends, is unlearning. The old thinking has to be unlearned, and these new ideals, grounded now in a spirituality, grounded in a power greater than ourselves, have to be learned. So that individual that he treated obviously was Bill W., one of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. A lot of the AA things came from a group called the Oxford Group, which was a Christian temperance movement founded by Frank Buckman, a Lutheran priest. And now Alcoholics Anonymous, 180 nations. There's hundreds, thousands of AA groups all over the world. And the fundamental of this idea is the concept of unlearning an entire psychic change and actually your life really depending on that. So this is crystallized in some of the AA thinking. I don't have a drinking problem, I have a thinking problem. These are these sayings, these mottos that we have in the recovery fellowships. I can't think my way into sober living, but I can live my way into sober thinking. So you have to learn these new set of behaviors, praying, going to meetings, making coffee, reading the big books, talking to a sponsor. There's this whole concept, faking it till you make it, and you live yourself into a new mindset. And there's an entire psychic change that happens in the process of that. So you're unlearning through behavior, through thinking, through action. And alcoholics have to go through this process of changing people, places, and things, which is why a lot of those, you spend time in rehab, you get out and go back to the people, places, and things, and you just relapse. And that's part of the entire psychic change. So let's apply this to church scenarios, thinking of revitalization or next levels of vitality. The military has a motto, right? It's better to learn than to be dead. And I wonder if there's a church motto in this too, that it's better to unlearn than to be closed. But I do find a lot of congregations unwilling to unlearn and would actually rather close than unlearn and try something different and think a different way and try different behaviors. So a couple things just to think of the key of ministry, applying this to ministry. Effectiveness cannot be replicated in another context without adaptation to that context. So we will talk about this in the institution avoids part of in coming weeks, but every success has to be achieved on its own terms in its own context. You can't just take something that worked in another place, pour water and stir in a new place and expect it to thrive because you've just skipped over the whole first part of contextual intelligence was reading the signs, understanding the culture, understanding the narrative, the story, the tell, digging in, understanding the layers of meaning. And missional vitality requires unlearning. It requires the humility to that what we think we know and learning the immediate context with fresh ears and eyes. So obviously, if our church is in decline and has been for a long time, there's obviously some things we need to unlearn, right, about that. And usually with this contextual intelligence framework, the problem is not usually the problem. Usually the thing that presents right? There's a deeper thing. Contextual intelligence is about being aware and seeing things, right? And understanding the picture of reality as it is. But it's also understanding the deeper spiritual truths behind those things. So when churches spit out pastors, four in a row or whatever, they just get it's these dang pastors, that they're usually that's not the problem, right? There's something else going on there beneath that. And contextual intelligence is kind of digging into that. And the first solution is not always the right solution. Like sometimes the impulse is, if it's the processor's the problem, let's get rid of them and get a new one in here. And then you get the same result again, because you didn't take the time to do the contextual analysis to really understand the social system, how it's situated in the context and the culture, and understanding all the intricacies of that. So usually we think there's one big solution to solve a problem. If we just do this thing, then it'll all get better. If we just had a preacher who was worth the salt, or if the congregation, if we just could get our building fixed up nice again, then people would come. Or if we changed the logo on our sign and became a different, mainline denomination, then people will pack into the pews. And usually that's just not the case. There's usually multiple ways to go at things. And we're going to talk about wicked problems when we get into the disorientation framework. There's problems that just are not easily resolvable that are very complex. When we need to define multiple possible problems, there's usually a lot of contributing contextual factors that we have to kind of sift through and organize. Remember, reading between the lines and seeing things as they really are. Then we decide which one of those problems is actionable, because there's usually a lot in a situation of decline or where a ministry is not going well, or even where it's flourishing and growing, or if it's plateaued. There's always things that can get better, but we got to deal with those problems, and we have to start by what are the things we can actually do where we don't get caught in the death by committee, death spiral thing, or trying to think through every possible thing. We just have to, this is actionable, we can do this, and then kind of iterate our way forward. So dreaming up possible solutions and iterating, prototyping, experimenting, failing is a contextually intelligent approach. It's not what we need to figure out the best possible plan and then execute it. Churches get so stuck on this, right? That if we just had the right plan, if we just have the right vision statement, if we just do such and such, and that's usually not true, unfortunately. There's multiple possible ways, and it requires an effectual reasoning process where we start with the effects of what we have and really reading the context in a sensitive way, and then iterating things forward. We generate these iterative experiments to prototype our way toward new possibilities rather than having that one single right solution that we think we have. So this was the Unlearning module. I hope that you enjoyed it, and see you on the next module.